still was not the whole world, whereas now really kind of this pandemic is impacting on all countries around the world.
The topic, how research is changed during this COVID-19. So thank you very much for doing this interview with us. First of all, I would like to ask you, what are the broader social impacts of COVID-19, and what are some of the major changes we might see in the world as a result of this?
Well, that's a very big question, because I think what we are experiencing right now with the COVID-19 pandemic is a crisis situation that the world has not seen before. There were pandemics before. Last 100 years ago, there was the Spanish flu pandemic, but that actually still was not the whole world. Whereas now, really, kind of this pandemic is impacting on all countries around the world, and it has resulted in a stopping of all the economies and the societies in lockdown and things like that. So it means that we are seeing a situation where we have to really rethink what are the things that we can and cannot do together as a society. And I think when we think about the impacts of this crisis, you can look at it at the global level, or at the national level, or at the more local and interpersonal level, right? So you have to look at the multiple impacts. And I think that's also very important for us as researchers to think that way. At the global level, what we are seeing is, well, a huge economic crisis everywhere. A lot of people made unemployed, but also one of the things that I'm really quite worried about is increased geopolitical tensions. Like, for example, between the United States and China, there is a lot of tension and a lot of hostility, which in fact is not a very good thing, especially because for all of us to come out of this crisis, we need global cooperation. So that means much more people focusing not so much on blame games, but more on how we can resolve the problems that we all have. So that's one issue. At the national level, when you look at what's happening in Australia, for example, well, I mean, all these things that happened in other countries has happened here as well. The COVID-19 epidemic itself has actually been quite well managed in Australia, but I think the economic impacts, they will still take a long time before we see what kind of implications that will have, because the government has put out a lot of assistance with the job keeper and the job seeker and things like that, but those are all very temporary measures. They are supposed to end by the end of September. And the question then is, what's going to happen then, right? I think a lot of people who have lost their jobs might not necessarily have any job back. So I think that will be a major issue that we are still, we don't know how the government will react to that, and how people in businesses, but also in universities, anywhere, kind of how we can respond to that. So I think we still have to think very hard about what life after the pandemic is over will be like. And yeah, and then we have also, of course, the more local and the personal level. You can see at the university is closed, and I think it's very hard, especially for students, PhD students who want to work on their thesis. We've seen that very much at ICS, Institute for Culture and Society, where students at one point could no longer access our building where they have their desk and where they want to work. So I think that that's a very difficult situation. And I can imagine, especially when you're an international student, being far away from your family and things like that, I think it is very, very difficult to deal with. So, and that too, I think we will see what changes that will bring in future. Will this mean that we will have less international students, or the students who are now doing their PhDs, what kind of jobs they might be able to get afterwards? I think that all those kinds of things are very uncertain right now.
Mm. So this kind of uncertainty is like in different levels, the national level, the institutional, and also individual kinds of levels.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, what are your thoughts about, these impacts, like as us as like PhD students or researchers to respond to this kind of different levels of challenges? How can we better prepare for the post-pandemic society?
You mean as students or as people in general?
Or perhaps would you be happy to talk about like students,
Okay.
HDR students?
HDR, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's a very hard question. I suppose that most PhD students are still going to continue and go ahead with doing their research. And I think that it's a good idea to do that as much as possible. I do think, though, that it might be good to keep in mind that the job market afterwards might be quite different from what you would have thought before the pandemic, right? So universities might, for example, not necessarily have more jobs available for new academics, which is what a lot of HDR students often want to become. They want to become an academic. So that might not necessarily be available, those new jobs. So it's important, I think, for HDR students to think more broadly about the kind of jobs they might want to try and develop themselves for. So I think being open-minded about different kinds of jobs, I think, is important. And in terms of research, developing your research skills, I think, is really an important thing to do, because I don't think that those things will go away, that we need those research skills. So that, I think, is important. And being quite pragmatic is, I think, also important, that, things will change. And I think we never would have thought that we would be in a situation like this. And I could imagine that for a lot of younger people, the next 10 years will be quite difficult, and therefore you have to be able to astutely respond to the situation in which you are in. So that would be my assessment of the situation. Yeah.
Okay. And what about Australia as a society? What are some future implications around how our actions and behaviors and practice might change in a post-pandemic society? Can you please comment on that?
That too, I think. Yeah. It's interesting. I think what is going to happen in the coming 6 months to 1 year, I think is really important. I do hope that we won't get another spike or more waves of the pandemic, because if that happens, then there has to be another lockdown that might have greater implications economically. But if that doesn't happen and the pandemic slowly disappears, but hopefully they will find a vaccine, but we can't be certain about that either. Over time, I think we will slowly get back to a situation where we can relate to each other more normally. But I think it will take some time before we know where that is going. So next 6 months to a year, I think it would be really still very uncertain. But I think in terms of the impacts that will kind of result in permanent change, let's say, I do think that we are now much more used to having Zoom meetings, for example. So I can imagine that many more meetings, work meetings, educational meetings, conferences, things like that might happen more with Zoom or other kind of web-based platforms. But that might also have an impact on kind of less people going to go shopping physically. They might order more things online. So basically, the digitization of society will probably become much more entrenched. And I think also other things that we have heard will have an impact is like travel, for example, whether we can travel as easily as we had been able to until the end of last year, let's say. So kind of at the moment, I think international travel is 80 to 90% down. So how will that come back, and to which extent will it come back? I think that's a big question. And that's just for many different reasons people traveled in the past. So it could be for work, but it could be for tourism, but also student travel and things like that. So I personally would find it very sad if we can't travel very much anymore, because I feel that that's part of my life. But I can imagine that it might become more difficult to do that. And that might have something to do with countries becoming more protectionist, so wanting to guard their borders more. And that, I think, is also kind of a threatening development, I'd say, because it means less exchange and less interaction and less ability for people to have engagement with other countries and things like that, and less cooperation as well. So that might be one of the impacts of this, and really quite a concerning impact, I'd say.
So the last point I want to ask is, can you elaborate a little bit more on this impact, like the inability, the constraints in relation to Australian culture, like, because Australian is well known for its multiculturalism.
Yes.
Yeah. So how this immobility may impact on that, please?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. That too, I think it's really up to people like myself, like you, to really point to the continued importance to promote multiculturalism as an important part of Australian life. Even before the pandemic, there were already quite a lot of negative developments in that respect. I think people becoming more nationalist and more reluctant to accept refugees and asylum seekers and people like that. But I think now there might be more people who feel vindicated by the sense that, well, we have to be much more protectionist of our borders. We don't like people who are different. And there is, of course, this very strong hostility right now towards people of Asian backgrounds, of Chinese backgrounds. The racism is becoming more pertinent. And I think all those things are issues that in Australia we really need to make sure that there is a strong resistance against that development. So it will be very important, really. And luckily, I do think that actually in Australia there are a lot of people who are pro-multiculturalism and pro-cultural diversity. So we have to make sure that we have those alliances as strong as possible. Because I do think that Australia can't go back to a situation in which it's just kind of a monocultural little island somewhere, because there are simply already too many migrants from many different parts of the world who have made Australia their home. So they can't really turn that back, luckily, you know. But we still need to remain vigilant against reactionary developments in that respect.
Thank you so much, Ien, for today. That's yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Xinhua. Good luck.
Thank you. That's a lot of really important issues you talk about, and thank you very much.
Blab Coats was created by Amidst and WRAY. Our team includes Ien Yu, MARINA Khan, Michael Horgan, Drew Martin, and Caden Cole. You can support us by giving us a like and sharing our content, as well as purchasing our merchandise. See description for links.